Welcome back. From the last class, we have started discussing about the pollination. In today's class, I am going to discuss about what is pollen-pistil interaction. We already know about the pollination. Pollination. What is pollination? Pollination means here the transfer of pollen grains. The transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. This process is called pollination. Here the pollination, it can be takes place by the help of different agents. The pollination, it can be takes place by the help of different agents. These agents like the wind it helps to pollination. The water, it also helps for pollination, and some animals like the insects, some birds and reptiles, and some primates, they act as agents of pollination. Here the wind and water, these are abiotic agents they are helps to pollination, and the animals, they are considered as the biotic agents. Insects, birds, reptiles, etc., they are considered as the biotic agents. These are the pollinating agents. Here the pollination, it can be takes place by the help of wind is called anemophily. The pollination which can be takes place by the help of wind is called anemophily. For example, here maize, papaya, these are the example for anemophily. And the second one is water. The pollination which can be takes place by the help of water is called hydrophily. For example, Wellisneria, hydrilla, these are the example for hydrophily. The animals, the pollination which can be takes place by the help of animals, that is called zoophily. In insect, the pollination, it can be takes place by the help of insects, that is called entomophily. These are the different agents, wind, water, or animals like insects, birds, reptiles. These are the different agents of pollination. By the help of these agents, the pollen grains, they are transferred towards the stigma. That process is called pollination. In today's class, I am going to discuss about how the pollen grain, they are interacted to the pistil, means the gynoecium part. Here the pollen grains, they are transferred towards the stigma or pistil by the help of different agents. It is the pistil part, it is the stigma, and this is the style. And it is the ovary. It is the pistil part, also it is considered as the gynoecium. By the help of different agents, the pollen grains, they are come and fall on the stigma. By the different agents like air or water, or it can be transferred by the help of different agents, animals. These pollen grains, they are come and fall on the stigmatic surface or stigma of the pistil part. It is the stigma of the pistil. Here these are the pollen grain. Consider it is the stigma. It is the stigma of Datura plant. And this is the black color pollen grains. They are the pollen grains of Datura plant. Datura plant pollen grains. Pollen grains. And the red color pollen grain is considered as hibiscus plant. Hibiscus pollen grain. Hibiscus pollen grain. Next. Here, by the help of different agents, they are come and fall on the stigmatic surface of stigma of the pollen grain. Next, here it is not sure of the same species pollen grain, they are come and fall on the stigma. It is not the sure of, or it is not the guarantee of the same species pollen grain, they are come and fall on the same species stigma. It means here the same species pollen grains means it is the right type pollen grain. The right type of pollen grain, and it is also considered as, or it is also called compatible pollen grain. Compatible pollen grain. Right type means the compatible pollen grain. It means the same species pollen grain. Here the Datura style, the Datura pollen grain, it come and fall on the Datura stigma. It means it is the same type of pollen grain and it is the right type of pollen grain. It is considered as the compatible pollen grain. Okay. Then the another one is hibiscus pollen grain is fall on the stigma. It is the different type because of the Datura is a different plant and the hibiscus plant is a different plant. It means it is the different type of pollen grain or the different species of pollen grain. It is called as the wrong type. The wrong type of pollen grain. Why it is called the wrong type of pollen grain? Because the hibiscus is a different species, different plant, and Datura is the different plant. These two are different plants. That's why it is considered as the wrong type of pollen grain, and it is also called incompatible pollen grain. Okay. The same species pollen grains means the right type of pollen grain. The different species pollen grain means the wrong type of pollen grain. Here the Datura pollen grain is fall on the Datura plant stigma. It means it is the compatible. It means the right type of pollen grain. The hibiscus is a different species pollen grain. It come and fall on the stigma. It means it is the wrong type of pollen grain. It is also called incompatible pollen grain. Okay. Then here the stigma, it has the capacity to recognize whether it is the same type of pollen grain or it is the different species pollen grain. The stigma has the capacity. The stigma has the capacity or the ability to recognize whether it is the same type or the right type of pollen grain or right type of pollen grain or it is the different type of pollen grain means wrong type of pollen grain. Here the stigma, it has the capacity or it has the ability to recognize whether it is the same species pollen grain or different species pollen grain, and that stigma, it only allow the same species pollen grain and it reject the different species pollen grain. Here the stigma, it only allows the same species pollen grain. It means the pollen tube, the pollen grain, it produces the pollen tube through the style, and the different species pollen grain means the wrong type of pollen grain, it can be rejected. Here the pollen grain, how the pollen grain it produces the pollen tube. Here the pollen grain means the stigma it allow only the compatible pollen grain. It only allows the compatible pollen grain and it rejects the incompatible. It rejects the incompatible pollen grain. Incompatible pollen grain. Here the compatible pollen grain, the stigma, it allow the compatible pollen grain means it produce the pollen tube through the style, and the incompatible pollen grain, it does not produce the pollen tube through the style. Then here we already know about the structure of pollen grain. Here the structure of pollen grain. The pollen grain has two layers. These are the outer layer is called exine and the inner layer is called intine. The outer layer exine has made up of the chemical that is sporopollenin. The sporopollenin chemical is present on the exine layer, and the intine layer is made up of cellulose and pectin. Here the sporopollenin chemical is absent in some places, and that places or that region is called germ pore. The sporopollenin chemical is absent in some region. That region is called germ pore. Germ pore. Then the pollen grain has two cells. The one is vegetative cell. And another one is generative cell. This is the structure of pollen grain. Here the plants, they are release the pollen grains. Almost all the plants, they are release the pollen grains in two-celled stage. It is the structure of pollen grain. It is the exine layer and this is the intine. This is exine and this is the intine layer. This is the germ pore. It is the germ pore. Then it is the vegetative cell and this is the generative cell. The plants which release the pollen grains in two-celled stage. It means the one is vegetative cell and the another one is generative cell. It means after the pollination, the pollen grain, it release or it produce the pollen tube through the germ pore. It produce the pollen tube through the germ pore. On that time, after the pollen tube produce the generative cell to produce the two male gametes. Here these are the two male gametes. After the pollination will occur, the generative cell produce the two male gametes. In some plants, they are release the three-celled pollen grains. This is the structure of pollen grain and this is the germ pore. Here it is the vegetative cell and this is the generative cell. Three-cell, it already the germinative cell, by the help of mitotic division, the generative cell produce the two male gametes. The vegetative cell is one cell and the two male gametes, these are the two cells. Totally the pollen grain has three cells. The some plants, they are release the pollen grains in three-celled. It is the three-celled pollen grains. It is the two-celled pollen grain. Two-celled means vegetative cell and generative cells. These are the only two cells. After the pollen tube germination, on that time the generative cell it produces the two male gametes. In some plants the pollen grains they are already the generative cell they are already produce the two male gametes. That's why that is called three-celled stage. Incompatible means the same type of pollen grain that can come and fall on the stigma. On that time the stigma allows the compatible pollen grain means the same species pollen grain. It allows for post pollination event means it leads to the fertilization, and the different species pollen grains the wrong type of pollen grain it will be rejected. Only it allows the compatible means the same species pollen grain it allows the stigma and it leads to the fertilization process. Here it is the ovary and the ovules they are present in the ovary. Here the compatible means the same type of pollen grain it produces the pollen tube through the style, and that pollen tube it reaches to the ovule. How the pollen tube reaches the ovule? Here it is the structure of ovule. These are the integuments. The pore is present at the one side of the ovule. That region is called microphylla region. That region is called microphylla region or microphyll. The opposite region of the microphyll is called chalazal region or chalazal end. And here it is the nucellus or it is the nucellus. In nucellus the female gametophyte, it means the embryo sac is present in the nucellus. This is the nucellus. In nucellus at the microphylla region it has the two synergid cell and the one is egg cell. At the chalazal region the three cells are present and those cells are called antipodal cells. These are antipodals. It is the egg cell. And these two are called synergid cells. Synergids. The synergid cell it has the finger-like projection or the finger-like tissue, and that finger-like tissue is called filiform apparatus. Filiform tissue or filiform apparatus. Here the pollen tube it produces the pollen grain, it produces the pollen tube through the style region, and this pollen tube it reaches the ovary and it enters through the microphylla region, the pollen tube. This is the pollen tube, and this pollen tube it enters into the ovule through the microphylla region. In some plants it reaches the ovule through the chalazal region. If the pollen tube it enters, the pollen tube enters through the microphylla region. Is called porogamy. The pollen grain it enters through the microphylla region is called porogamy. If the pollen tube, it enters through the chalazal region, is called chalazagamy. Is called chalazagamy. The chalazagamy, it is the rare case. Means in only some plants the chalazagamy is occurs. Almost all the plants, the pollen tube is enters through the microphylla region. Then here the pollen tube is enters to the microphylla region, and that pollen grain is enters into the one of the synergid cell. The pollen tube is enters into the one of the synergid cells. They are present at the microphylla region. Why these pollen grains are enters to the synergid cells? Because of these synergid cells are having the filiform apparatus, and that filiform apparatus tissue, it helps the pollen tube where it releases the male gamete. It guides the pollen tube where it produces where it releases these two male gametes. That's why these pollen tube, it enters into the microphylla region, and first they are entered into the one of the synergid cell. That is called porogamy. Next, deposition of pollen pistil interaction. The deposition of pollen grain on the stigma. Here the deposition of pollen grain on the stigma. It is the stigma of the pollen pistil. The deposition of the pollen grain on the stigma and germination of the pollen tube through the stigma. Here the pollen grains, they are produce the pollen tube, that is the germination process. The germination of pollen on the stigma and growth of the pollen tube, the pollen grain, it produces the pollen tube through the style region. The pollen tube, it grows through the style, and the entry of pollen tube, the pollen grain, it enters through the ovule. The entry of pollen tube to the ovule, that entire process is called pollen pistil interaction. The deposition of pollen grain on the stigma, the germination of the pollen grain on the stigma, and the pollen tube, it produced through the style and it reaches to the ovule. That entire process is called pollen pistil interaction. This is the pollen pistil interaction definition. This is the today's class. Thank you.